My name is Alan Williams, and welcome to this episode of History Matters, the podcast of the Canadian Institute for Historical Education. The CIHE's mission is promoting historical literacy through research, education, and engagement in the public square. And we regularly host live events with historians, writers, and other thinkers who can help foster a deeper understanding of Canadian history in all its complexity. Today's episode is the first of two, taken from an event held in Toronto on March 1st, 2025, with Professor Nigel Biggar, Regius Professor of Moral and Pastoral Theology at the University of Oxford, and author of Colonialism, A Moral Reckoning, published in 2023, and Professor Margaret MacMillan, formerly of the University of Toronto, Warden of St. Anthony's College, Oxford, Companion of the Order of Canada, and author of Paris 1919, and The Uses and Abuses of History, among other books. In this first episode of two, we feature Professor Biggar's opening statement on March 1st, 2025. Next week, we will publish the conversation between Professor Biggar and Professor MacMillan after his opening statement. And now, here's Professor Biggar.
I'm really pleased to be here for at least two reasons. First of all, I feel an affinity with Canada. My Scottish family gave its name to one of the Algonquin lakes and a township in Saskatchewan. I began my academic career in Vancouver. I didn't study in Toronto, but I did marry in Trinity College Chapel and lived on Pape and Danforth for 2 years in the early 80s. So this is not my home, but it feels like home. The second reason I'm glad to be here is because I think, and clearly you think, that the topic we're going to discuss is really, really important. And it is really, really important. So I'm glad you turned up. It would not be the same without you. So my plan is to talk for about 35 minutes, and then Margaret and I will have a conversation, and then the floor is open to you. The heart of what I'll talk about is how I try and make a moral assessment of the elephant that is the British Empire. And of course, as a Briton, that's of direct relevance to me, but of course it is of relevance to you, because without the Empire, Canada wouldn't be here. Not as Canada. Before I focus on that, I want to put our discussion in context, because one of the main deficiencies of public discussion of things colonial is the lack of context. So that things that went wrong or were bad things that were done are given an exaggerated form. So here's the context. First of all, for most of history, for most people, empire was a fact of life. Up until the end of the First World War, probably most people lived under empires. And long before Western European nations developed colonial empires overseas in the 18th and 19th centuries, we had empire in the Middle East or the Near East, Babylonian, Assyrian, Egyptian, Greek, Roman. We had empire in South America and Mesoamerica with the Incas and the Aztecs, empire in China. Empire is a universal political form. One of the things that got me into trouble, first of all, on this topic in 2017 was that I and a leading historian of empire, John Darwin, had launched a research project called Ethics in Empire, and the aim of the project was to ask, how did ancient Chinese people, or how did medieval Arabs, Muslims, how did they view the empires of their day? Did they regard empire as a bad thing in the way that we tend to? And one thing we discovered very early on is, if you want to find an ancient Chinese or medieval Arab critique of empire, you won't find it. You will find treatises on what makes a good or bad emperor, but empire as a form of political organization was taken completely for granted. Okay, so the universality of empire as a political form up until the last century is part of the context for discussing the British Empire. A related part of the context is that the mass migration of peoples, again, is a universal phenomenon. The United States and Canada were created largely by the mass migration of peoples from Europe, mainly in the 19th century. But in the 1600s, in the 1640s, the Iroquois Confederacy expanded northward across the Great Lakes, overwhelming the Huron, who then moved westward, displacing other native Canadian or Native American peoples. That was Iroquois Empire. And by the way, when they overwhelmed other peoples, the Iroquois adopted the women and children and tortured and ate the men, according to first-hand witnesses. In the 1700s, the Comanche expanded eastwards, I think, and overwhelmed the Apache and created what one Finnish-born, Oxford-based historian calls a vast slave economy. In the 1820s, Shaka, King Shaka of the Zulu, caused the Zulu to expand westward, overwhelming other African peoples in what the Africans refer to as the Umfakani, or the crushing. And then in 1835, the Maori sailed from what's now called New Zealand to the Chatham Islands, where they slaughtered 10% of the Moriori population and enslaved the rest. When Admiral Arthur Phillip landed in Sydney Cove in 1788 in what became New South Wales, he ordered his men to share their catches of fish with the Aboriginal people. He held open house. The Aboriginal people walked into his house and he had them sit down and eat with him. He discovered that the Aboriginals were suffering from an outbreak of smallpox, he offered medical treatment. And when, in one confrontation, he was speared in the thigh by Aboriginal, he refused to retaliate. Now, the subsequent history of relations between settlers and Aboriginals was not happy. There was lots of mistrust and violence. I'm not whitewashing that. But I'm saying two things. First of all, the mass migration of peoples, universal, not just white people. And secondly, the intrusion of one people onto another people's territory took different forms, some more benign than others. As for motives, well, lots of motives for people to migrate across the world. The original reason why English sailors created enclaves on the eastern seaboard of North America was to harry the shipping of the Spanish Empire. So ironically, the beginnings of English empire were anti-imperial. The other reason, of course, was that many of the English had learnt, as it happens, false tales of piles of gold to be found in the Americas, and they came in search of gold, which I've always thought was a rather grubby, avaricious motive. But then, if you read about the Australian gold fields or the Californian gold fields or the Malayan gold fields in the 19th century, lots of Chinese people migrated to those gold fields in search of a fortune. So before we focus in on British colonialism, Canadian colonial history, that's the context. A word about judging the past. Whenever we judge the past, we do need to use our imaginations. We get to live in societies in Canada and Britain that enjoy unprecedented security, unprecedented good health, unprecedented wealth on average. We're privileged. Most people in the past, even in our own countries, did not enjoy that. And so we need to, before we judge, we need to consider the circumstances. And one circumstance I'll come back to at the end of my talk when I talk about the issue about residential schools and their funding. One circumstance is we need to remember that in the past, states were much smaller and had much fewer resources. I'll come back to that later. And secondly, in terms of judging the past, for example, we are all rightly convinced that slavery is a bad thing. A lot of people, until about 1800, weren't so convinced. The fact that we are absolutely convinced, we owe to what our ancestors had to learn the hard way. Right? There was a process of enlightenment, of which we are the beneficiaries. And no doubt in the future, people will judge us for having failed to realize certain things, but we're in the process of learning. So when we look back and judge our ancestors critically, as probably we must, we need to do with a certain measure of humility, because we know things they couldn't see clearly because they learnt them. Okay. So, how to make sense of the British Empire morally, and by the way, I'm a professional ethicist, not a professional historian. So my argument, and you'll find this in the conclusion to my book, the argument is really is in three stages. First of all, having in the bulk of the book, having considered the British experience, and by the way, the British Empire lasted 400 years from roughly 1550 to 1950 or 60, and it stretched from Newfoundland to New Zealand. So the British Empire was all sorts of different things at different times. Sometimes it was different things at the same time in different places. So it's quite hard to come up with an overall judgment. But what I do in the conclusion to the book is to start by saying, okay, so having surveyed the empire, we come up with two lists. There's in the imperial ledger. There's a debit column and there's a credit column. And in the debit column, or the negative column, there are such things as brutal slavery for about 150 years, the epidemic spread of disease, although, by the way, it's important, although the spread of disease among Native Americans as among Aboriginal peoples was devastating. And according to one historian, if a Native American people suffered successive epidemics of disease over a 50-year period, it would lose 90% of its population. Yeah, devastating. But no one intended to do that. No one intended to do that. Any more, I think, than the Chinese intended to spread COVID and kill 7 million people. And by the way, of course, it's not just white people who spread disease. It was Indonesian fishermen who brought smallpox to the Northern Territories of Australia. But without a doubt, the European arrival in North America, one of the most devastating effects was disease. In addition, British colonialism caused economic, social, and cultural disruption. There were certainly elements of racial contempt, racism, and there were instances of native peoples being unfairly evicted from their land, and there were cases of broken treaties. And if you look on page 276, you'll see there's a longer list of the bad stuff. So I'm not averting my eyes from the bad stuff. It's all there on page 276. But on page 277, there's another list of the good stuff, the positive ledger, which included the fact that the British were among the first peoples in the history of the world to repudiate slave trading and slavery, which had hitherto been a universal institution practiced on every continent by people of every skin color. And then in the subsequent 150 years, the empire used its imperial power to suppress slavery from Brazil to New Zealand. The empire also created regional peace by imposing an overarching imperial authority on hitherto warring peoples. Colonial government helped to moderate the inevitable impact of Western modernity upon very unmodern societies. If the British hadn't settled Australia, it would have been the French or the Americans. Modernity was coming to these shores and to Australia's, one way or another. And given the cultural gulf between modern industrializing societies and Neolithic societies, the impact was bound to be devastating on native peoples. The empire also provided a civil service and judiciary that was generally and extraordinarily incorrupt. It disseminated modern agriculture and medicine. It brought up three of the most prosperous and liberal countries now on earth, your own, Australia and New Zealand, and it gave birth to two more, the United States and Israel. And by the way, if you look at the 2023 World Values Survey, which surveyed, I think, about 20 or 30 countries worldwide, and among other things asked respondents two questions. Would you object to having as a neighbor someone of a different race? And would you object to having as a neighbor an immigrant? Both tests of racial prejudice. I can report that Canada, Australia, and Britain scored the lowest, or among the lowest scores, in stark contrast to Russia, China, and Iran. So it appears, according to that survey, that those countries of the former British Empire are among the least racist in the world, according to that survey. Again, on page 277, there's a longer list of the benefits or the achievements. So you end up with a kind of list of benefits and costs, or goods and evils. And the question is, which weighs more heavily? And my answer is, we can't tell. We can't tell. Because you can't weigh chalk against cheese. You can't say that so much racism was worth the blessings of emancipation from slavery. You can't say that so many unjustly killed people was worth the blessings of imperial imposed peace. You can't weigh these things up. They're not the same kinds of thing. So that's the first step of my argument. You can't do a kind of cost-benefit analysis. The second step of the argument is to say this. Okay, so what some people do, and the current critics of European and British colonialism do this. What they say is, well, it doesn't matter that the empire built bridges or whatever, because the empire was at its heart racist and exploitative and violent, right? So in the same way that it is true that Nazi Germany developed the Volkswagen. I drive one, or rather my wife drives it. It's a very good car. I believe Hitler had some role in designing it. And of course, the Nazi government built autobahns, which is good to drive Volkswagens on. But the point is this: none of that compensates for Auschwitz, does it? Right. So what many of the critics of British Empire nowadays want to say is that the British Empire was like Nazism. So So it was essentially racist. Churchill was equal to or worse than Hitler. The British ran concentration camps in South Africa. They committed genocide in Tasmania. That's the criticism. So in my book, I consider those criticisms, and in each case, I say, no, there was no genocide in Tasmania. The concentration camps in South Africa during the Boer War had nothing whatsoever to do with the concentration camps in Nazi Germany. And no, whatever his failings, Hitler was not like, Churchill was not equivalent to Hitler. And no, you can't say the empire was essentially racist. I mean, among other things, the commitment to anti-slavery that the empire took up in the second half of its existence was based on the fundamental premise of the equality of all human beings under God, regardless of race. That's why slavery is bad. So I consider the charge that the empire was essentially evil, like Nazism, and I say, no, it wasn't. So, first step is, we can't do a cost-benefit analysis. Secondly, we cannot say the empire was essentially bad or racist or exploitative. And then the third step is to say, well, in addition, there were a number of humanitarian and liberal achievements. And there's a bit of an irony here, because those who criticize my view on British empire and colonialism think of themselves as being progressive. What I'm saying about the empire is that the empire contained liberal and progressive elements, which is why I approve of it, insofar as it did that. The elements really were genuine. So, for example, I mentioned the movement to abolish slavery in the late 17 and early 1800s. In the early 1900s, that expanded into a general concern about the impact of colonization on Aboriginal peoples in Australia in particular. And the imperial and colonial policy was assimilation in the sense of wanting to enable indigenous peoples to take part in the new society as equal citizens, which is why the vote was given black Africans in Cape Colony in 1853 on the same terms as whites. The vote was given to all Maori males in 1867 before it was granted to whites, and the vote was given to indigenous Canadians in 1885 in eastern Canada. Unfortunately, 10 years later, Wilfrid Laurier revoked the vote because the native Canadians were all voting Tory. But I know assimilation is regarded as a bad thing nowadays, but let me just put this to you. When two peoples encounter each other, there are only three possible outcomes: annihilation, apartheid, or assimilation. Now, the assimilation doesn't have to be absolute, but there has to be some kind of integration. And British imperial policy was never apartheid and never annihilation. It was always assimilation, to a certain extent. So that's the first, if you like, liberal and humanitarian impulse that gathers speed in the 19th century in the empire. The second is the export of liberal institutions of... Now, the empire was never democratic until 1930s in India. But then, you know, universal suffrage didn't reach Britain until 1928, both men and women. We forget. I think New Zealand got there first. But the British did, through liberal laws, it did permit a free press, so that Africans black Africans in South Africa could launch their own newspaper in the 1890s, funded actually by Cecil Rhodes. And the press in Hong Kong and in India and Kenya and South Africa was often fiercely critical of colonial government. And the judiciary in Kenya during the Mau Mau emergency of the 1950s and 60s was fiercely critical of colonial government. In other words, the empire, by exporting liberal institutions, made colonial government accountable in a way that government in China, Iran, and Russia today is not accountable. Then the third liberal element was this. The vision of the empire eventually relaxing into what became the Commonwealth. So a centrally run empire relaxing into a voluntary association of independent states. That came to maturity in about 1917, but the germs were there in the 1820s. In the 1820s, all of the three major East India Company ports in India were governed by Scotsmen. Every one of them said in writing that we British cannot expect to be here forever ruling these people. All we can hope to do is to help Indians to develop sufficiently stable government and then go with grace and hopefully with goodwill. And in spite of attempts by imperialists to, as it were, centralize the British Empire into something like the United States, that was a project that was flourishing in the early decades of the 1900s. Australia, Canada, New Zealand, South Africa didn't want that. So it was Jan Smuts who coined the phrase, the Commonwealth of Nations in 1917. By 1930, Canada, Australia, New Zealand, South Africa were virtually independent states. India was on the same track from 1919. And then finally, the final, I guess, expression of the empire's liberal and humanitarian commitment was the fact that in 1939, the empire, not just Britain, the empire went to war against Nazi Germany. And between May 1940 and when France fell and June 1941, when Germany invaded the Soviet Union, the British Empire offered Nazi Germany the only military resistance, with the sole exception of Greece. And that is why, if you find yourself driving in Sicily, to the southwest of Mount Etna, and you're driving eastwards from Regal Bhutto to Adjira, you will spot on the left-hand side a Second World War military cemetery. And if you get out of your car, as my wife and I did some years ago, and walk into the cemetery, you will find yourself surrounded by young Canadians. And if you wander among the headstones, you will come across one to a lad from Winnipeg called H.R. Anderson, killed on the 8th of July, 1943. And Anderson's headstone bears the striking, laconic epitaph, "Anti-fascist fighter." Anderson was a volunteer, didn't have to go, he was called. Who called him? The Empire. So, that's the moral sense I try to make of the British Empire that, among other things, helped to build Canada. I'm going to end by talking about the residential schools. And I'm well aware that that is an incendiary topic in your country. I'm well aware that, from what I've heard, that some Canadians can pay very high costs for saying what I'm about to say. Not my country, not my problem. So let me say, first of all, I appreciate that people have very, very deep feelings about this, feelings of grievance, and I acknowledge the feelings of grievance. But then I have to say, feelings can lie. Feelings are based on perceptions. Perceptions can be mistaken. And if public policy is shaped by false perceptions, everyone suffers. So it's really important I really mean you, we in Canada, have an honest discussion about the truth about the past, the whole truth about the past, and the evidence for it. So let me just summarize my current view, and I stand before you to be corrected. I might be mistaken. And I stand here to be corrected, but I'll tell you what I think. First of all, it's uncontroversial, I think, that in the residential schools of Canada, First Nations kids were sick and died at rates well above the average, as was revealed in the report by Dr. Bryce in 1907. That did lead to improvements in 1910, but the fact that Bryce wrote a book in 1922 called The Story of a National Crime suggests that he didn't think the improvements were adequate. Okay, but that I think that's fact. Two causes of the high susceptibility of Indian kids to disease were, first of all, their own susceptibility, which was, as I've explained, higher than Europeans. Secondly, putting all these vulnerable kids in a confined space was likely to lead to a greater incidence of disease. And then the funding model of the schools at the end of the 1800s was per capita. So residential schools struggling for resources had an incentive to over-recruit and overcrowd, which exacerbated the problem of the spread of disease. So that I think is clear. It's clear also there were instances of unjust cultural disparagement, in particular a racist discouragement of native language. And there is evidence of instances of sexual abuse by staff of kids. And that's all lamentable. But from the evidence I've read, there was no mass murder. There was no atrocity, from the evidence I've read. So that the claims of mass graves of murdered kids, in 4 years, no evidence of that has been discovered. No reliable evidence has been discovered. Also, there has been a suppression of positive testimony by people who were in the residential schools. Why do I say that? For two reasons. First of all, J.R. Miller, who wrote what I think it's a very measured and I think a standard history of the school's Shingwalk's vision. Writing in 1996, he observed even then that the media were very interested in stories of abuse, not interested in hearing positive stories. And then if you read the report of the Truth and Reconciliation Commission in 2015, there is an acknowledgement that some Indigenous Canadians have good tales to tell about the schools, acknowledgement, but it's very glancing, and it's immediately, as it were, pushed off the table by the remark that when survivors heard this testimony from other Indigenous people, they were very upset. And so the question of of trying to get some idea of the scale of the bad stuff in relation to the good stuff that other Indigenous peoples testified to, that was completely avoided because the good testimony was just ignored. As for widespread sexual abuse in the schools, from what I read, it's not clear to me how widespread that was. First of all, Miller says a lot of it was not perpetrated by staff on minors, adults on minors, it was by boys and other boys. And I have to tell you frankly, folks, if you've been to an all-male boarding school as I have, if you put a lot of adolescent males all together in a boarding school, there will be a lot of homosexual activity, most of it consensual. So I don't know, from what I've read, just how big the problem of sexual abuse was in these schools. And as for the discouragement of native language, I mean, I think there were instances where the motive was racist. On the other hand, we all know if you want to learn a language, total immersion is the most efficient way. And part of the point of the schools was to teach indigenous kids English so they could be full participants in the society that was developing. And it's not true that all schools forbade the teaching of, the speaking of native languages. Some permitted it outside of the classroom. Which brings us to the final issue of funding. The conditions of the schools were very poor, except that, not clear to me, I mean, given the conditions in most places in the late 1800s were pretty poor. I'm not sure how much poorer they were, but they were poor. And Miller certainly is scathing in his book about parsimonious bureaucrats in Ottawa for whom the financial bottom line was all they cared about. I'm a bit skeptical about that because it's the kind of remark an academic would make who's never had any responsibility for public expenditure. Because, we all know, and we hear it all the time, lobbyists, rightly caring about this group of people, want more public funding for this cause. What they don't particularly care about is where the funding is going to come from, because if it's going to go to this pot, it's got to come out of that pot. So the question of whether the Ottawa could have spent more money on the schools, it's possible they could have done and should have done, but in order to know that, I need to see an argument that tells me that the money should have gone into residential schools and out of defence, or out of the administration of justice, or out of civil government. But I've seen no argument to that effect. And this brings us to the need for the exercise of historical imagination. I don't know about Canada, but right now in Britain, governments get to spend about 46% of GDP. In 1900, that was 8%. In the US, at 1900, it was 3%. Miller somewhere tells the story that in the 1870s, the US government spent as much money fighting frontier wars as the total Ottawa budget. And Jed Martin, a retired professor from the University of Edinburgh, where he ran a Centre of Canadian Studies, says that in 1882, under the premiership of John A. Macdonald, during the famine in the Western Plains, Ottawa spent more on Indian affairs than it spent on defence, spent more on Indian affairs than it spent on the administration of justice throughout Canada, and spent more on Indian affairs than it spent on civil government. So, whether Ottawa should have been more generous with funding to the residential schools, I'm willing to be persuaded. I've just not seen an argument. So, in sum, my view of the residential schools is this. There were undoubtedly deficiencies in funding and living conditions. There was certainly some cultural and sexual abuse. The public record to date, I think, has been distorted by the suppression of positive testimony. There was, as far as the evidence I've read, no atrocity. There was far less malice than is supposed. And given good intentions unable to command sufficient resources, there was a lot of tragedy. That's what I think. Thank you very much.
You've been listening to Professor Nigel Biggar, Professor of Pastoral and Moral Theology at the University of Oxford and author of the 2023 book, Colonialism, A Moral Reckoning. This was an opening statement at an event held in Toronto on March 1st, 2025. Join us again next week for the conversation which followed that statement between Professor Biggar and Professor Margaret MacMillan. If you like what you heard today, subscribe to History Matters on Spotify, Apple Podcasts, or YouTube. You can reach me or the members of the Canadian Institute for Historical Education by email at info@cihe.ca.